Hi, everybody. We're back. Okay, so I just want to get this out there right now. So we're in a theater, and quite often there's these very strict codes of behavior in theaters when you're in rooms that are built like this one with a big stage and the seats that don't move and all the things. So we're gonna just try to be with each other in a way in the next session that's not so much like you would be with each other in a theater necessarily. We are gonna have some opportunities where you're gonna talk to each other in the theater. So at a later point, I'll invite you to move in ways that allow you to clump together and have some conversations. But we're gonna roll with it. We're just gonna be super real and authentic here. We're gonna see how we go. And we have some absolutely incredible guests who have come to be with us today to talk about advancing reconciliation, equity, and accessibility in granting. So it is my absolute and complete pleasure to introduce right now these fantastic speakers. I will introduce them all for you, and then I will tell you a little bit of context about what we're gonna do together today. So we've got Andrew Hseih from Toronto Arts Council. We've got Bushra Junaid from Ontario Arts Council. We've got Jordan Baylon from Calgary Arts Development. We've got Barbara Mumby from San Francisco Arts Commission, and we've got Hseih from City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture. I can't wait to get right out of the way and let them start talking, because what they have to offer is, I think, really exciting in terms of some fantastic examples of what we might consider here in Vancouver as some new and interesting ways to think about changing up the way we think about grants here in Vancouver. So I just want to give you a little idea of how this session is going to go. We're going to begin by hearing from our panelists. They've each very kindly. So first of all, let's just name. All of the conversations we're having today are huge conversations. Part of this is about what Roop was talking about when we were talking about our community agreements, that we are accepting and expecting non-closure. So we had a fantastic conversation last night. We wish we could do an entire symposium just on this conversation. And I think that's true for all of the conversations on our agenda today. And today, we have these 90 minutes to be with one another and to make what we can out of the incredible offerings we're going to hear. We will hear from our guests who very kindly have condensed their incredible expertise into very bite-sized presentations at my behest, so it's entirely on me that they are so brief in their comments. We're going to hear from them. We're going to have a little bit of conversation with the panel. Then we're going to be lucky to have 3 local folks who we've invited to respond to what they hear and to share that response with you. And through their responses, we're going to sow the seeds for the discussion that will happen amongst the folks in the room thereafter. So what we're really interested in here today is, what are the things that these fine folks have to share with us that might be spectacular for changing the way we think about granting in Vancouver? So what are those elements, ideas, programs, initiatives? And how might we bring those into our particular unique context in this community? How might we tweak those things? How might we embed those in a particular way, in a good way, to fit with the particular and unique context of our cultural ecology here in Vancouver? So that's what we're looking to explore today. What could we use here, and how could we best use it here? We're looking for you to walk away today with some new ideas about what's possible, and also to leave behind with the city, for the purposes of the strategy, what you believe to be the most possible effective options and opportunities for us, and how best to work those into our context here. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? I can see you, so if you nod, I can see you. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's nice. I like that. Just like you talk to me, we're talking to each other. It's going to be nice. All right. Fantastic. So let's have no further ado and let us invite our first fantastic presenter to come and tell us a little bit about how they do things in the T-Dot. Andrew Hseih, will you please join us here at the podium? Andrew Hseih, everybody.
Thanks very much, Jocelyn. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today to talk a little bit about what we've tried in Toronto at the Toronto Arts Council. And listening to the speakers this morning, I was reminded of something incredibly important, which is that when we tried to affect a systemic change, we need to change the way decisions are made. And I think that's going to come up over and over again. I think in the next 6 minutes, maybe 5 minutes while I speak to you and throughout the rest of the speakers today. But I want to start, if I could have my first slide, please, a bit about Toronto, actually. So Toronto Arts Council is the funding body for the City of Toronto for artists and arts organizations. Toronto is a place that has 230 distinct ethnic origins in terms of the people who live there, and over 140 languages spoken. The scope of our granting is on the screen. We process about 2,400 applications. We give out just under 1,000 grants a year, and we have a success rate overall of 40%. I will return to one of those stats later. I think some acknowledgement of a history of equity at TAC is essential. Go back 27 years ago to 1992 when the Cultural Equity Report was written by consultant Betty Julian, which led to some key initiatives. Culture Force initiatives that were authored by Lillian Allen and Sharon Fernandez and Rita Fraticelli, but it really grounded equity, especially cultural and racial equity, as core values of the Toronto Arts Council and led to community engaged program design for new initiatives. Fast forward 27 years to 2017, where we decided to codify our equity practices and principles and also expand on them to be inclusive not just of people of color and Indigenous people, but also people living with disabilities, people living with mental health illness, deaf people, two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, and pansexual persons. And then to create what we've called the Toronto Arts Council Equity Framework, which was adopted by our board of directors in 2017, really to address the most underserved communities. And those four large groups with such a vast array of experiences for people in each group are our equity priority groups. Next slide, please. It is somewhat difficult in the time allotted to go into any depth with the range of equity measures we've tried and we're practicing currently at the Toronto Arts Council. But I just want to say off the top that as a process, what these equity initiatives have in common is that they recognize differential experience and they treat people differently to address those different experiences and the barriers to access of public funding. One of the things we're doing right off the top is trying to reduce eligibility barriers. These are things like taking into account equivalent professional experience of artists. Last year, for the first year, we introduced a voluntary self-identification form, which allows us to, without the peer reviewers seeing the information, identify people that relate to or self-identify as part of our equity priority groups. It helps us to plan our outreach. It also helps us to implement what we call the equity priority policy. That equity priority policy relates to the project grant programs and the operating grant programs. When we have applications of similar or equal merit, but not enough funds to go around, we prioritize applications from applicants that identify with our equity priority groups. In our operating programs, what we've tried, when we are giving increases or allocating increases to operating organizations, these are organizations that receive grants every year and tend to be some of the larger or more established arts organizations in the city. We recognize and identify historic barriers to funding and prioritize addressing those barriers before giving increases to those that have not experienced them. And also a key thing we introduced last year is new questions in our operating programs where we're asking all of the organizations, especially the larger institutions, to reflect on how they're implementing equity both in their artistic programming and in their operations. How are they being more inclusive of people that identify with our equity priority groups, and to reflect on that. And that now makes up 10% of the overall score of those operating applications. Very, very briefly, we've introduced jury, committee, and board composition targets to be reflective of the diversity of people that live in Toronto and our equity priority groups. We've introduced application accessibility support, so people that need help submitting an application to the Toronto Arts Council can receive up to $500 a year to do that, to work with somebody to help them do that. To guide our equity work, we've established an equity steering committee, which I lead, which keeps us on track and helps us develop annual equity action plans. And we've introduced staff equity training for things like the history of Indigenous peoples of the area, bias awareness, intercultural competence. I could go on. Next slide, please. Last slide. I just want to touch briefly on some of the programs we've introduced. All of them have been developed in collaboration with community, starting with the Indigenous Arts Projects Program, which is run by an Indigenous program manager, is juried by all Indigenous artists. And this year, actually, we've introduced a rolling deadline to acknowledge Indigenous ways of making and reduce those barriers so people can apply at any time and receive the result approximately 3 months later. Going back to the success rates, this program, the Indigenous Arts Projects Program, has an 82% success rate. We've recently expanded what we call the TAC Accessibility Grant, which provides up to $5,000 in additional funding for projects that involve artists who have a disability or are deaf or are living with mental health illness to all of our project programs. We have 2 newcomer and refugee programs, one for artists to engage with newcomer and refugee families, another to provide mentorship support to newcomer artists to work with established artists. And I'll just wrap it up with some of our partner initiatives. Toronto Lit Up is with International Festival of Authors. It really enables book launches of emerging artists, targeted involvement of our writers of color, Indigenous writers, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIAP writers. And then an important part of the work we're trying to do at the Arts Council, just as I wrap up, is pushing the work outside of the downtown core, providing access to audiences outside of the downtown core, and we have a suite of strategic programs to help us do that, including animating Toronto parks, animating historic sites, artists in the libraries. And another program to engage youth is with Outreach Toronto. The Toronto Arts Council provides funding for Outreach Toronto's high-impact granting to youth and underserved communities. I'll just close with one note. We've just started analyzing their first year of voluntary data, and the results are encouraging. We find that I'm just going to throw some numbers at you, if that's okay. 86% of applicants fill out the form. We find that the success rate for applicants identifying with our equity priority groups is higher than the overall average. It's 44% rather than 40%. And we look to this kind of data to really help us inform over time both our outreach initiatives to communities we're not reaching well enough and to design new programs. Thank you, and I apologize for how rapid that was. Thank you.
On that note, Andrew, I'm going to just give us a beat after every speaker. So I want us to take a quiet minute here and for you to just reflect on what you just heard and allow to bubble to the surface the things that resonated for you in what you just heard from Andrew. So we're just going to take a minute of quiet for you to reflect on what resonated for you from what Andrew shared with us. All right, we're going to move right along. Could I have the next slide, please? We'd love to have Barbara come on up and tell us a little bit about what's going on down in Frisco. Barbara, take it away. Thank you so much.
Good morning. I first want to say I'm humbled and honored to be here, and I would like to thank the Musqueam, Suquamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people for opening their territory to myself and to honor my ancestry of the Concow Maidu of California, as well as the Powhatan from the East Coast. So I honor my ancestors by acknowledging them as well. Next slide. Great. So I have the privilege of spearheading what is called the Cultural Equity Endowment Fund, and what is unique to San Francisco, or as you may well know, that the Bay Area is kind of the hotbed of public engagement and activism. So in that vein, the Cultural Equity Endowment Fund was a community-led initiative of activists in the arts community who did not like the way city funding was being allocated, that it wasn't serving marginalized communities, and it was going to the larger budget institutions. So they developed a coalition, and they advocated for this endowment fund, which has been leading our work for over 25 years. And that fund ensures that funding goes to all of the marginalized communities that were named in the legislation, but we're also able to extend it because, as we know, we evolve, and we have communities that come in and out of our purview in 25 years. It was a relatively small fund for 20 years. It remained relatively flat, but then in 2015, the community mobilized once again in the fashion of the Bay Area and advocated for its first increase. They were very boldened by that success, so just this past November, they were able to pass a ballot voter-approved initiative that will, in essence, increase our grant-making budget through an equity framework by up to 4% each year. And for context, the endowment started at approximately $2 million. This current year will be granting about $11 million. So we're looking at quite a big investment in the community based purely on community activism. So mobilizing communities can make things change. Our framework that we approach our work through is the 3 points that are listed there. We're constantly asking who has access. And the way that we ensure that marginalized communities have access is various forms, from working with technical assistants, capacity builders, grant writers, to ensuring that our applications are streamlined and simplified and accessible, and always being open to criticism and critique and working with community to refine ongoing. We look at power. Who holds the power to make these decisions? The way that our funding is resourced is through a public panel process. So all of our panels that review grant applications have representatives, peer representatives from the applicants. So it's a wide range of not only genre knowledge and expertise, but also the specific communities that they represent also reflect the applicants. So it is a peer-reviewed, community-based process that ranks the applications to provide the Arts Commission our funding recommendations. Representation is also very important. We try to have a very diverse staff. I work to make sure that my team represents the communities that we're serving. When we don't, we try to bring in expertise to help us with that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that on my final slide. Next slide, thank you. What is beautiful about being able to do this work for 25, or having this in place for 25 years, is that we've been able to plant seeds for a broader conversation around equity. So similar to what Toronto is doing, we've been able to kind of push the envelope a little bit and push the dialogue toward larger systematic changes. The first of which is because of our grant-making department that we actually have a racial equity working group. We have participated in what also Seattle is participating in, the Government Alliance for Racial Equity, which is for city-based departments, to talk about equity and how to infuse those values throughout our work. This racial equity working group has also created the first racial equity statement within the city of San Francisco, and is also inclusive of land acknowledgement for the Ramaytush Ohlone, which is unique. Unfortunately, we don't have the representation in San Francisco like you see here in Vancouver, so we have to do whatever we can to ensure that they're not continuing to be erased, and this is just one small way that we can do that. We actually have advocated, and I have to admit that we do look to Seattle for a lot of our innovative approaches to equity. So not unlike what they do in Seattle, we have our first racial equity analyst who helps hold all that information. So it's not just the burden of my team to be that expert. It is infusing that information out throughout not only our agency, but through our whole city family. She's looked to as an expert that informs and are part of conversations. And then through this work and all of the efforts, we've been able to engage our own commissioners because we have a 15-seat commissioner that helps us make our decisions or oversees our work. And we've included them in our trainings and everything that we've done around racial equity. So then when instances such as community contested statuaries come up, they're very versed in understanding the importance of having a very frank and open conversation and being supportive of communities. So we were able to remove in September a 125-year-old statue that sat in Civic Center that represented the subjugation of indigenous people in California, the only representation of Native people in the city. So we were able to take that down largely, I feel, as a result of all of our equity work, as well as, again, community advocacy. Community is very important. And then this has also paved way with the new funding that we're receiving from the ballot initiative that we just passed. We have committed a large sum of money to a racial equity initiative. We don't quite know what that'll look like. We'll look to all of our partners to help develop that. But it is showing a deep commitment for our agency and kind of setting a trend throughout the city of what we need to do around equity. Next slide. And just two little tidbits of what we're doing in context. We do a lot of things, but one of the ways that we ensure accessibility, again, is through representation. We have this past year instituted what we call cultural ambassadors, and there's kind of two levels. There's cultural ambassador light, so to speak, and then the little deeper touch. What they do, because we collect data. Data is really important to us to ensure that we're meeting our mandates. We engage individuals that are really true representatives of those communities that we're trying to engage. And we on staff may either not have the capacity or the connection. So we are able to provide stipends to community members who will help us with outreach. They will get the word out. They will be the host, so to speak, when we have trainings and technical assistant workshops. And what some have done is kind of went beyond that and have provided their own TA and workshops, kind of the train-the-trainer model on their own to engage. And as a result of this, the first year, our individual artist applications have more than doubled. And the data is showing that it looks like it's in response to this additional outreach that we're doing. The kind of deeper touch is that we engaged a consultant through the cultural ambassadors to be that ambassador to the Indigenous and Pacific Islander communities. Okay, I'm rushing. And she provided one-on-one technical assistance, workshops, as well as one-on-one coaching. And out of the applicants, there was about a 90% acceptance rate in those grants that she worked with. And that just really infused enthusiasm within those communities. And then finally is our American Indian Initiative. So that's really fun and exciting.
Go for it.
I can? It's
Yes.
a lot. So with the statue, the momentum of the statue and community engagement and all of the buy-in that we have, it's our first time that the city, spearheaded through the Arts Commission, will be doing a year-long initiative to uplift the Native community, especially knowing that it's the 50th anniversary of the occupation of Alcatraz. So it's going to be a year-long event of engaging exhibits, events, and something that we don't have in San Francisco. Unlike a beautiful city like Vancouver, you have more of that presence. So I'm happy to talk more about that, but my time's up, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I just want to really reinforce it is on me that these are so short. So please do not think that these fine folks wouldn't sit here and talk to you literally all day about these beautiful initiatives. So let's take a beat and just allow anything that Barbara talked about that really sort of resonated for you, that hit you somewhere. Let's take a beat to allow that to bubble to the surface and hold on to that. All right, next slide, please. Now it is my great pleasure to invite up here the extraordinarily stylish Jordan Baylon, who's going to tell us what they're up to over there in Calgary. And I did live in Calgary for a few years, and so it is so exciting for me to hear, this was 15 years ago, but to hear all the great things that are happening in that great city. So Jordan, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Time is short. I'll give you some context about Calgary Arts Development. So we are an arm's length municipal arts development group, works just like an arts council. We fund around 160 some odd organizations operationally. Recently, we received a transformational increase in our budget from the city of Calgary, and that's been a big deal for us. It's probably never happened before our organization was founded and the arts were funded in the region. And so by 2022, we're looking at our budget growing to $15.9 million, which is a great thing for our community. And it also created an opportunity for us to think through how we might approach our programs differently. So in the lead up to all of this largesse that we now have the benefit of, we were thinking about how we could make our community more equitable and diverse and really foster an equalized sense of belonging among all of our different communities through the arts. But before we did that, we really wanted to make sure that we weren't making a lot of assumptions about what our community was like. And so for our 2016 and 17 reporting year, we asked all of those organizations that we fund to participate in a sort of demographic profile survey. So it was mandatory as part of the funding that they received, but that just meant that they had to distribute it to all of the employees, volunteers, and artists that they work with, at which point it was on a sort of voluntary self-disclosure basis. So we got around 3,000 respondents from that, and there are some interesting findings that came out of that, which we hope will sort of ground us as we embark on a more shared conversation around what this funding system looks like for all of the people that it affects. So I'll give you some sort of highlights from that report. You'll see a link up on the top right there. You can follow up with me after if you want more information, but the whole report is published. And then for those of you stats buffs out there, there are a lot of infographics and charts and context that I probably will not be well equipped to offer you today. So no big surprise, one of the biggest findings that we saw in terms of the arts organizations that we fund is that there was a lack of representation around lines of ethnic and racial identity. So we fund around, we saw 15% visible minorities in the cohort that we surveyed, and that is less than half of what the demographics of Calgary are based on the last census data we have. And of course, a big part of this are our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in the arts community. That was almost statistically insignificant in terms of the results that we got back, which unfortunately is also in line with the broader data that we were able to sort of benchmark against. I think what this tells us is that an approach like this is not going to give us the whole picture. And so we're also thinking about different ways that we need to foster those relationships and create connections with artists that are working within those contexts. I'll speak more about that in a little bit. And we're also seeing a lack of representation in organizations we fund for artists that identify as deaf, disabled, with mental illness or mad arts. And so something for us to all think about. And then lastly, we see a lot of correlations between markers of gender, age, and ethnicity in relation to levels of income that artists in our community receive. So if you are transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid, or female identified person of color working in our community, chances are you're not getting paid as much as the average across the sector. So what do we do from here? As a grantor, we wanted to think about what we could do to sort of disrupt this system and make create some interventions that would help move us further. And so, yeah, perfect. And so one of the things that we wanted to tackle first was the context of the panels. right? So we know that this is a really colonial way of making decisions and selecting artists and valuing the work that they do. And so this was our first sort of target in terms of how we could change some things. And so first and foremost, we're trying to be very intentional about representation on our panels so that there is a majority perspective there that isn't from dominant culture and represents a lot of different intersections of identity that better reflect the communities that access these processes. Furthermore, if you've been on a jury before, you're probably familiar with the sort of honorarium system that's involved. That is predicated on an assumption that you have the ability to be part of these panels as a volunteer. But you know that it's not volunteer work, right? You're reading scores and scores of applications. It takes up weeks of time. And that in and of itself creates barriers for lots of perspectives that could be really important for those conversations. So what we've committed to in our recent budgeting is the proper remuneration and support for those people who are fulfilling that really valuable role in our community. So at the very least, we are setting our rates of remuneration for jury process at minimum wage. And we hope to continue to grow that as our budgets increase in recognition of the time and effort that people invest in that process. As a part of our jury process, we're also thinking about what sort of relationships are engendered by this type of a granting process, this panel process. And so one of the things that we really wanted to attend to is how we set the table for those conversations. I was really impressed to see the type of group agreements that Jocelyn and the team shared with us this morning, because I think being really intentional about how we come into a space and how we recognize others is extremely important for the jury context, as it is for any gathering of people from all different sorts of identities. So one of the big things that comes up in jury contexts is, I guess, an unquestioned assumption that there are universal standards of artistic excellence, of excellence in engagement with communities, of even rubrics to understand what is appropriate in particular art forms and milieus. And so I think as we embark on more equity work, we want to really tackle the idea that there's any sort of universal ideals that could be expressed in a way that is the same for everyone. So just like Andrew said, are we coming from a place where we are starting from and acknowledging and valuing the differences that are brought into the space? And as a result, we try to acknowledge bias in a way where we're not sidestepping it. We're not coming into the space thinking that there's one way to be fair. Instead, we bring with us all of the natural inclinations or disinclinations we have, share that with everyone in the room, allow them to hold us accountable to ourselves and to each other in that conversation. So this is a type of training that we are starting to pilot through all of our granting programs. And then we mentioned the group agreements. How do we be really intentional about the spaces that we occupy? And then lastly, as a sort of overarching philosophy for this portion of what I'll share with you, there are three tenets that we are trying to live by as we continue to evolve our processes in a dynamic way. So I'm going to name drop Jan Derbyshire, who's a wonderful artist and who works with us over the last 3 years and is really a proponent of what she calls inclusive design. And within that inclusive design, there are these three tenets. The first one is one size fits one. So granting processes are designed in a one-size-fits-all way, in which case there's a written online application, one set of guidelines that are meant to govern all of the different types of conversations you have. Instead, we want to create more flexibility so that there are equitable access points for people that doesn't work for. So it's not about throwing everything out the window, but instead, how can we develop more flexibility within that context? And then nothing about us without us. So really important that we're not just thinking about representation in a tokenizing way, that we are actually being co-conspirators and collaborators with the very communities that our work touch. And then lastly, virtuous cycles. I understand that when you're embarking on equity work, it can feel like the stakes are high. And certainly there's a lot of potential for there to be discomfort, misunderstanding, and sometimes conflict. But I think one thing that we're learning is that we can't not try things. The idea is that just like in cycles of innovation, we craft small experiments with a radical intent so that we can actually prototype our learning and grow from our mistakes. So that's something that grantors have to take on, who are generally very risk averse. One more slide and I'll go so quick. These are two programs that we're embarking on as our sort of beginning to tackle issues of equity within our granting processes. The first I won't speak too much about. It's called ArtShare, and basically the notion is, instead of using this one-size-fits-all process, how can we approach our relationship with artists in a way where we're actually meeting them where they are at? And then as grantors, taking responsibility for the rigor that we are asked to honor as stewards of public funds. In other words, we take on the application process. If you are an equity-seeking artist or community, come meet with us. We talk to you about what you value, how you identify, what will be important to move your practice forward, and then in any way that's appropriate, we help craft that application process and provide that support in that one-size-fits-one way. And then, she's coming closer. Lastly, this is a really important process to us. This original People's Investment Program was our foray into truth and reconciliation and really bringing everyone to a shared conversation. So this program was an indigenized grant design process where we engaged a group of indigenous artists, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit artists to actually design and craft a framework and a granting program that was aligned to their own values and ways of knowing. And then what we got out of that is an application process that really values an oral component. And then also shout out to Kathy and Seattle. We took an idea for a granting program that actually sidesteps the traditional jury process. So instead of a closed group of artistic elites making all the decisions from which you don't know how those decisions were made and feedback takes months and months and months, we've created a process where if you are an artist applying to this program, you are also invited to be part of the selection process in a community circle format. And so, of course, all of those things that I shared about group agreements and how we hold space and creating a context for appreciative inquiry are really important here. Our first deadline is coming up on this coming Friday, so we're really excited about that, and we know that there's going to be a lot of learnings that come out of that, so stay in touch, and we hope to share more about what comes out of that process as we continue. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jordan. Thank you, Jordan. Lots there, lots in this whole morning session, but let's just take a beat. What were the elements that Jordan shared from Calgary that are resonating for you that might be useful to us here in Vancouver? Let's take a moment to think about what's resonating for you. All right, could I have the next slide, please? Bushra, I realize that we have been in conversation via email, and you know how it is, right? You talk to somebody over email a bunch, and then you realize I did not even ask you if I had accurately pronounced your last name. And so I want to learn from my mentor, Christy Charles, who told us about the importance of naming. And please share with me, is it Junaid? Junaid, Bushra Junaid, come on up and tell us about what's going on in Ontario. Bushra stubbed her toe 2 days before getting on the plane to come here. Toe universe. So here she is. Thanks for being with us.
Yes. Thank you for this generous invitation. And I want to acknowledge and thank the First Peoples of this territory for inviting us and generously allowing us to participate here today. So I'm going to just give a little bit of context for the Ontario Arts Council and then speak to a couple of specific granting programs that that I personally manage. So I just want to, Ontario Arts Council, we're an arm's length agency of the government of Ontario, and we're publicly funded through taxpayer dollars through the Provincial Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport. So in 2017-18, we gave out $58.7 million, $48.2 million to organizations, and $10.5 million to individuals. We received 3,768 grant applications, and were able to fund 1,474 orgs and 2,294 individual artists. Though we receive government funding, our decisions about grants and funding are made by peer assessment panels of artists, arts administrators, arts community members that reflect the diversity of art practices, disciplines, and people across the province. And I will touch a little bit more on that. So grants are organized by artistic discipline as well as activity such as creating and presenting, building audiences and markets, engaging communities and schools, and developing careers and art services. We're currently working with a strategic plan that was launched in 2014, so we're kind of coming to the nearing the end of our plan, Vital Arts and Public Value. And that plan encapsulates the two sides of OAC's mandate, which are to serve both the arts community and the public. And it builds on work that the OAC has been doing since the early 2000s with our two plans, Strength and Stability, Stability and Strength, and Connections and Creativity. The work on the current plan that we're doing involved an environmental scan, online questionnaire of 28,000 individual artists and organizations that received operating funding from OAC, other funders and stakeholders in the arts. And the survey covered topics including key needs and issues facing the arts sector, those that OAC should address, OAC's role, appropriate focus for our activities, and an exploration of public value, and our goals over the 6-year period that we're currently working on. And I mentioned we involved a survey of close to 2,000 individuals, and we got about 1,500 completed surveys. We also had focus group sessions with people to probe more deeply into issues and topics of the survey. And the focus groups included each of OAC's existing priority groups and a couple of others, new generation artists, deaf artists and artists with disabilities, senior artists, artists of color, and Indigenous artists, and artists outside of Toronto, and our operating organization. So the findings of all of that, the environmental scan, the survey, and the focus groups are all available on our website if you're interested in reading them under a summary of our external consultation that we did. And so it was clear from that, all of that work, that people are really deeply committed to the arts in Ontario and about OAC. And people really shared their candid views on what the work that we were doing and where they felt we should be going. And building on that, we also had involved the board and staff in facilitated sessions as well. So our entire process and plan is published on our website, and encourage you to go there and take a look at that. So OAC, we serve multiple communities in an increasingly diverse province. Andrew sort of touched on sort of the composition of the city of Toronto itself. As a public agency and funder and employer, we're committed to access and equity. And by this, we mean treating people fairly and taking into account and accommodating different barriers and needs so that all groups and communities can have access to opportunities and resources. Systemic barriers and regional disparities in the arts sector require us to develop an equity lens that guides our decision making. So over the years, we've introduced programs, policies, and procedures that help to support equity, diversity, and inclusion. Included in our strategic plan, embedded at its core, is OAC's equity plan, which outlines the specific objectives OAC is committed to achieving in order to address and remove barriers in its programs, processes, and services. That includes also a multi-year accessibility plan and accommodation policies for applicants and assessors using OAC's online grant application system that we call NOVA. So we're committed to... All right, so yeah, I'll get right through to the granting programs. I just wanted to talk about being committed to ensuring equitable access for all Ontarians, with emphasis on what we call priority groups, which I mentioned, and equity-seeking communities. Peer assessment being really an important principle in practice, and striving to ensure that our equity panels represent the range of applications received at a funding deadline and the diversity of the province. We also instruct all of our assessors to adhere to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Ontario Human Rights Code when considering access, opportunity, impact in funding applications. For example, where 2 applications are equally scored, the one from a priority group artist should be the one funded. So, on to the 2 funding programs. Indigenous arts professionals and arts professionals of color may be confronted with a lack of infrastructure and resources to develop their careers, including opportunities for coaching, mentorship, skills development, professional development, connecting with presenters, networking, and developing formal networks. And few, if any, artists or artist-run centers and organizations established to serve them. So one of OAC's strategies for addressing this was the launch of the Skills and Career Development Program for Indigenous arts professionals and arts professionals of color, formerly called Access and Career Development. This is a program we introduced in 2006, and it supports the cultural diversity of Ontario's arts sector through study, training, mentorship, internship, and portfolio development, or documentation of existing artwork. It offers project grants. It's open to emerging, mid-career, and established artists from all disciplines and practices, and it really working as a critical entry point to OAC and serving as an important function to outreaching to Indigenous communities and communities of color, including newcomer artists, social service agencies, immigrant services, and new arts organizations. Since its inception, we have supported about 690 arts professionals and funded about approximately $5.3 million in funding. I'm just going to give you a couple examples just to make this alive. So an Indigenous artist, for example, received funding for a self-directed study in Alaskan dance, and they pursued training in traditional and contemporary aesthetics by attending 3 festivals and engaging in choreographic investigation. Another example I'll give you, an artist of color receiving funding for a project called Design Intensive in Dance, and they worked with 3 dance companies in Canada, England, and Germany for 8-week intervals, and each company varied in size, age, and repertoire, and subsequently they were hired full-time as the lighting supervisor at the Canadian Opera Company, so really having impact in terms of building people's careers. I also want to just touch on the Deaf and Disability Arts Projects Program, which supports creation, production, and professional development for deaf artists and artists with disabilities. This is a newer program because deaf artists and artists with disabilities are our newest priority group. We've had 4 funding deadlines and been able to support about 75 artists. The program is assessed by a peer group of deaf artists and artists with disabilities. For the past couple of years, we've been having a separate panel to assess the work of deaf artists, which is facilitated by a deaf facilitator. It's in meetings and all take place in ASL, and it's helping us to build the capacity to, I hope, introduce a deaf arts program in the future. So that's where I'll leave it for now, and thank you.
Thank you, Bushra. Once again, I want to invite us to take a beat and just think about what from Bushra's offerings is resonating for us as potentially useful here in Vancouver. Could I have the next slide, please? Kathy Shea from Seattle. Been doing this work a long time. We're really lucky to have, as we are with all of our fabulous panelists, you here to share with us what you're up to in Seattle. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Since it's going to be impossible for me to cover everything I'd love to say in 5 minutes, I'm just going to first just invite all of you. I'm here all day. If you see me anywhere, I'm actually really shy and introverted in person. So I encourage you to come up to me. Let's talk and let's have a dialogue, and I can go deep into any of these things. I'll probably ask you a lot of questions. But that's what I would really encourage more than anything else, is to build more relationship while we're here. Okay, so what I'm going to do in the few minutes I have is just really focus on the core thing that we kind of center at our office, City of Seattle, Office of Arts and Culture. It's not just one program that's going to get us there. So rather than going deep into that, but I could, and ditto everything everyone else said, we have variations of all of those things that we try to do and carry out as well. But the real core is it's really centered in a way of being. Our culture has to shift. So we at the Office of Arts and Culture are really looking at redefining what are our core values in terms of how we are acting and centering and being. In order to really make change, it has to start from our core beliefs and philosophy and way of living and acting. That is the center. Everything else, they're just experiments that we're trying, and who knows what will work and what will not, but that has to change first, is who we are and how we act. As a city government office, we have a responsibility to uphold anti-racist practices and work towards reconciliation, reparation, equity, and inclusion and accessibility. Our goal is to inspire the rest of our community, all of us, to work towards that same goal. And because it will take all of us working together in order to make this happen, we have to use a multi-pronged approach, because that's how racism and inequity got embedded into our cultural systems and structures in the first place. And so the only way we're going to be able to change that is we have to actually work together as a whole community of every sector, cross-sector. But arts can be a leader in making that happen. By centering intersectional racial equity, that means leading with race, but being cognizant that we are always being inclusive of all the intersections of the spectrum of gender, ability, immigrant status, sexual orientation, etc. That we are centering intersectional racial equity in everything that we do, and we aim to center the artists and arts and cultural organizations that have always been working in this way. It's been core value of all of our Indigenous communities. As it was said in the opening plenary, this is a way of life. It is not something that you take on or you do today. It is a way of life. It's part of who we are. And that we are partnering with the entire arts and cultural sector to do the same. And as we do, then the arts and stories that are being created and made and shared and made visible and amplified, these will reflect these same values. And that's what will be shared with the community through these art forms. So artists have always been the people that reflect the values of a society. And so that's why the arts and culture of our communities is the leader in this effort. So how do we do this? Seattle started with the Race and Social Justice Initiative. And we really, sorry, still on the first slide. We started with the Race and Social Justice Initiative, and it started with learning what we don't know. Internal insight comes first before we can expect anyone that we fund to follow. The second slide, the main tenet, a foundation of our core value is centering people first. We need to build relationships with people. So we center the communities that have been and still are facing the greatest inequities by ensuring that they are at the table from before the beginning of any program development. Greater racial equity awareness must be centered and in the learning and experience of our Indigenous and oppressed communities, because they have the greatest expertise in what is not working. And only through partnership with all of them together can we actually make the change that we want to create greater racial equity. So it's about deep listening and then taking action to honor what we heard, not for, but with. We need to hire the people, involve them, the people who represent these communities as our artists, as our staff, as our panelists, as our advisors. We have a number of different programs where communities of color share with us what we need to do as government to change, to become more inclusive and accessible to the community. It's not the other way around. The bottom line is that true equity comes when we truly see, hear, and value each person for the full spectrum of their humanity. So we need to be in community with community in order to really make the community more equitable. Our best practice and core values are, these are just a whole hit list of really quick things, so please talk to me later. Funding should help organizations achieve their own missions and artists to achieve their own visions. We should not be setting what they need to do to get our funding. We need to actually give funding to help them support what they want to do and have been doing and are striving to do. Through the process of applying, the applicants will gain a better understanding of what racial equity means. And again, this is centered on what we have learned from working with our Indigenous communities and our people of color communities in terms of what they feel is important to center. We need a role model what equity is and our funding opportunities for the community to do the same. Our funding partnership is not just about money, but needs to create transformational value. Sorry, I set my own timer, so I'm gonna race through this really quickly. Our funding partnerships is not just about money, but about creating transformational value. So everything that we do, we consider partnerships, not grant making, because grant making seems very hierarchical to me. So it's about partnerships where every grant relationship that we have is about creating leadership opportunities, collective organizing, asset-centered framework, community connections. It's about a learning growth mindset centered in curiosity, empathy, grace, and the desire to transform for the betterment of our holistic community. And just some really quick examples of stuff. We had a Communities of Color think tank is where we center huge amounts of money in communities of color to be our partners. But since we're taking them away a little bit of their time from their own missions or their own work, we need to center that, we need to give them far, far more money than just the hourly rate of their time. Earned income strategies for how we can actually create, not just through grants, but earned income strategies for communities of color where we value them always for their time. Racial equity trainings and learning cohorts. We have spaces and resources centered in what communities of color want and need. We have a whole bunch of racial equity trainings where it's actually, we do some trainings that are about creating greater awareness for the predominantly white institutions to learn what their role is. But we've been actually investing far more money into self-care strategies for communities of color, ways that they can center and value their own styles of leadership, which are not based on white hierarchical colonizer norms, how to value themselves and lead through their own abilities and expertise. We do racial equity self-assessments through all of our grant applications to help predominantly white institutions gain greater awareness. Implicit bias trainings for our panelists. 80 to 100% of our panelists are from people of color communities. We've set up programs and systems of checking in regularly with communities of color and communities centered in the disability realm. and always resource them for their time. We're experimenting with a wide variety of forms of grant making based on their input, and we're trying to create solidarity rather than competition. So everything that we do, we try to bring people together in community with each other across race, and we focus on an asset-centered framework, and we must be willing to go against the systems that have been holding colonizer power in place. And sometimes that just means breaking the rules, and even though we're in city government, actually partnering with the legal department to change the laws to make these changes happen. Thank you.
So also there's this. Kathy, is it possible for us to make this available for folks? And we can discuss potentially making all of our slides available for folks. I'm really putting people on the spot here, but given that we have had so little time, Kathy, thank you so much. Let's take it one more beat and just whatever Kathy talked about that really resonated for you, allow that to kind of bubble up and be in your consciousness. Okay, team, I'm just gonna be really real with y'all. It's 12:35. We have 25 minutes, and in that time, we're gonna hear from our local leaders who are gonna give us their response, and then we're gonna have some opportunity to discuss together in small groups. So it is my great honor at this time to invite our respondents up to the stage. So I'll get you to advance the slide, please, and we'll have Kim Senclip-Harvey, actor, director, and playwright, Valerie Singh-Turner from Visceral Visions and the director of Diverse Theatre BC, and Jen Thomas from Coastal Jazz. Kim, I'm going to ask you to begin, and I am going to give you 3 minutes, and I'm going to just be sweetly and gently creeping up on you when it's time.
Great. As long as we
Okay.
end with like a hug.
I would literally love nothing more than that.
Great.
Kim,
Perfect.
take it away.
I also want to acknowledge and deeply thank the territory of the people who continue to allow me to be a guest here, as well as the panelists for their time and generosity. My head is still, as yours is probably, is percolating with what exactly, how I can best distill what would be, I think, applicable in the city of Vancouver. A couple things to start. I'm an independent artist, and as an Indigenous independent, I deliberately practice and do process this way to hold on to my sovereignty. As an Indigenous person, having sovereignty in all aspects of my life is incredibly important. My biggest criticism of all of the arts fundings that I intersect with, the BC Arts Council, the City of Vancouver, and the Canada Council, and some private ones, is the fact that I have to manipulate myself and break my arms to become eligible, which makes me complicit in upholding settler, colonial, and white supremacy. So it's a big conundrum for me. How can I be an Indigenous sovereign artist and intersect to pay my bills without having to manipulate myself to be something that I'm not? And I wrestle with that often because for me, the process is the art. So the highlights that I'm going to focus on are ones that actually become accomplices with me, who actually want to meet me and honor who I am without forcing me to change and alter who I am to become eligible, because I don't sleep very well when I have to do that. So for the first one with Andrew, the Indigenous Arts Projects, I think that's an incredible, the success rate with 82%. I think that you spoke about a responsiveness, and I think that deliberate understanding of where Indigenous communities come from without a pan-Indigenous approach is incredibly important, as well as the Equity Steering Committee. You talked about cultural competency training, and holy moly Christ, is a lot of my time having to train staff workers on what it is they have to do to equitably engage with us. If institutions started doing that more, you would take the burden off of people of color and oppressed artists to have to express how you kind of have to do your job better. Barbara, the Cultural Ambassadors Program, again, with that, you talked about the relational work that I think is really important, and also acknowledging the gaps in the council or the body's work. I think it's really important that I like the use of the word inclusive instead of diverse. Diverse, I think, is an othering that is actually quite damaging. I also am not a believer in reconciliation. I don't think there's anything to reconcile. It was a shit relationship to start. So I'm a focus on these new relationships of actually understanding what we need to create new relational working and intersections with. Jordan, I really appreciated the radical breaking up of the institutions that you spoke about. That's what we actually need in these institutions. We need people who acknowledge that these systems were not built for a lot of us. They weren't built for us to be successful. They weren't built for us to be received. And we actually need your help if you're going to be the inside insurgents in radically breaking apart these things to be able to meet us where we're at. So I'm not going to meet your strategic pillars. I am not going to be one of your core competencies because in all honesty, you don't talk to me enough. So I appreciated that. Also, the disruption and the interaction you spoke about. Bushra, UNDRIP, yes. That should be implemented in everything that we do. The United Declaration of Indigenous Peoples. And then Kathy, just so many wonderful things about meeting people where they are, recognizing that this goes beyond an artistic process. The siloing and categorization and the really possessive need to silo and understand the aspects of how I create is such a colonial value. I don't even actually acknowledge myself as an artist. I'm a contributing community member where art practice helps me better serve the community. And so the more that you can start to understand the spherical nature of the way Indigenous people work, the more you're not going to make me feel like something you need to dissect and understand from a metric base. The other last portion I just want to say is that I appreciated the relational aspects of how you worked. I know that data is really important to governance, but data makes me feel like a fucking petri dish. So when you ask us to fill out these forms and you ask us to use this data, there's been a really harsh and harmful history of settlers studying Indigenous people, and I really find that challenging. So the more that you can understand and make us have relational, qualitative understandings of how we work, I think the better off we all be, and I was excited to hear some of that work, especially with you, Kathy, so thank you.
Valerie, we'd love to hear from you. And Jen, if you wouldn't mind just coming and standing with me on the side here, that would be great. Valerie, I'm going to do the same thing. I'll give you 3 minutes and sort of mosey along in a gentle, loving way.
So nothing like following Kim Senclip Harvey, setting a high standard. And I want to acknowledge the colorfulness of this panel up here. Like, it does my heart good to see representation personified and embodied. This is what the staff of our cultural agencies should be looking like, representing our community. So that is one of the big things I wanted to notice first, acknowledge first. What to do in 3 minutes. So, Andrew, like the whole equity framework and the addressing systemic systems and barriers, looking at all of those things, I think the systems are super important for us to interrogate. I prefer to use a lens of decolonization rather than the idea of inclusivity. Equity is obviously super important as well. Barbara, I was looking at, the thing that resonated for me was your cultural ambassador program and how you are engaging artists from equity-seeking communities to do the outreach, paying them to do this, and to really bringing in, the artists who have been historically excluded from being funded to do the work that they do as artists. So that's funnily enough, I was talking to one of the City of Vancouver officers about a similar kind of program because the program I'm doing, Diverse Theatre BC, we have an ambassador program which we are paying artists a monthly fee and we give them a ticket allowance and a hospitality allowance to go out into the community to meet the artists where they live and work and to tell them about Diverse Theatre BC, which is a program or an initiative, a digital initiative to promote and foster and gather and connect Indigenous and racialized artists. Let's see, what else have I got here? Go away. Jordan, questioning the idea of universal standards is utterly important. I can't say enough about that. This idea that there is one standard of artistic excellence is a very colonial construct that I love the idea that we're pushing back against that. Also, acknowledging bias in everyone and offering bias training, particularly to juries who sit on assessment committees. I think that is really important to acknowledge those things, because I think there's a lot of people who believe that they are objective when every single person is subjective. We have our internal biases, every single one of them. Sorry, every single one of us. This is in contrast to a Canada Council officer who I spoke with, who, when I was talking about the makeup of the juries and how that really needs to be interrogated and reevaluated, when he was telling me that that they always make sure that there's at least one person of color on a jury of 4, and 2 is like, you know, they're doing their job. I was going, no, you need 3 people of color. 1 always has to be Indigenous. You can only have 1 person who is of European background. And we went, because I said, if you have 2 people of European background, you have an overrepresentation of one perspective. And he kept pushing back. He said, no, 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 you can't do that. And I said, hey, finally, like, he said, okay, you can't have 3 artists of color on a jury of 4 because artists of color have an agenda. And we do, for equity and for representation. Like, so again, like, that is something I encourage all grant agencies to consider, that you should not have an overrepresentation of the European or colonial perspective on juries. Kathy, can you come live here? Or at least come back and do like a week with us here, just to talk about what you're doing. I love that you have a lens of intersectional racial equity, because so many times people think equity means white people with disability, white women, white artists who are deaf, white, everything else is white, so then we are good, right? But no, intersectional racial equity is what we should be striving towards. So thank you so much for all of your amazing initiatives. I wish I could say more, but Jocelyn.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Thank you. Thank you. And Jen Thomas, come on up for our last reflection.
Thank you very much to the panelists for sharing your learned wisdom with us today and for visiting. This was a fantastic event. And thank you, Jocelyn, for wrangling, despite our... It's all good. The things that I'm going to take away from this panel that I think the City of Vancouver can too are the importance of collaboration and outreach stemming from that collaboration. Implementation of systems without consultation with the communities who are going to be affected by those systems is basically colonialism, and we're going to stop doing that now, I believe. The community-led program development that's been going on for 25 years in San Francisco, I think is a system that is ripe for introduction and more like development and support here in Vancouver. Let the communities who know what they want to do tell us and tell the city, and then support those communities in doing what they need to do. Also, outreach. The creation of city, municipal employees, provincial employees who go out to the communities, help them with grants, tell them what is available, explain the systems that may or may not be sufficiently accessible, but more importantly, develop accessibility vectors, and then let the communities who need them know about them. Don't make people come and ask for accommodation and the communication that they need. Bring it to them, because that way it's actually helping. And I'm going to stop because that lady's scaring me.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jen. So now we want to hear from you. And by hear, I mean see. And by see, I mean work together and write on cards. So this is what's going to happen. I'm going to take a... Can I use somebody's wireless mic? Are any of these hot? On? Does anybody hear me? Great. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. We're going to ask you to get into groups right here in the theater. So either where you're already located, to lean in, talk to each other, small groups, groups 4 or 5, whatever works for you. Our fantastic team of facilitators are going to be coming through the space and passing out to you some cards and one Sharpie per group to think about with one another and reflect with one another. What are some of the things? So what could work here in Vancouver? And on the other side of the card, how? How might this work in Vancouver? So please go ahead and move yourselves into small groups so that you have at least 4 people in your group. And I'm gonna ask to continue the slide, please. And one more. Here we are. So the questions are on the cards, and our facilitators will share a writing implement. So your conversation together is, what could work in Vancouver, and how could it work in Vancouver? So much beautiful content, like what that's worth. Just so like inside, even just my response is so honest how important. I think sometimes what I have heard from my peers in the community is a real sense of cynicism of like there's no way to change the status quo. And I think hearing real world examples of how you in fact very much can. You can break the rules, you can like dismantle, you can disrupt, you can recreate, you can rebuild, is incredibly important. So thank you so much to share. Is anyone going to be leaving after lunch? I just want to let people know who they have access to perhaps connect with over lunch or for the rest of the day. You're going to be out of the way. Okay. Is everyone else going to sort of be here through to the... Okay.
I feel really bad though because I didn't get to speak to some very key things. I didn't. Yeah, like
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, so I don't know if we have a minute to give the last. But
unfortunately, literally, we're barely have enough time for this. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. It's okay.
I wonder if anyone has the jam. I mean, I don't want to ask you to do more than.
Do you guys want some?
Thank you. If you have final comments, if you want to share like further comments, I'm sure that there's a way that we can disseminate them, but they won't be able to be spoken in the space. But yeah, if you have final things that you want to like make sure that our people hear, like send them to me, and I will find a way to ensure that they get shared with the folks who are. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. Thanks for being flexible.
Do we have a role in this part of the process, or should we just wait?
You're happy to wait. You can like mosey around if you want. You're welcome to do that. Yeah. Whatever you want to do.
Okay. I might go in and just like listen.
Yeah, please. By all means.
If it's not intruding on.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, please go right ahead. Basically, I'm going to invite people to stay in here and keep talking and
Sure,
writing
yeah.
past the end of our session. I think we can do that. Like tech and speech. But anyway, but to allow them to talk. Please go.
I mean, I think continue those conversations are really great. We could just do a rotating conference throughout all those styles.
Pilot on other subjects like GIA. Yeah, we went last year. We'll probably go again this year. Yeah. Denver this year. Yeah. You're saying you have a bunch of conferences that happen in Ontario.
I don't know what our plans, but I mean, there's like the funders forums and it's fairly, there's really something. I'm looking forward to that one.
Oh, there's the Arts Council is putting together kind of
They came up with a name.
conference. I haven't been in touch.
No, it's called Munarts. Municipal Arts.
That's right.
I think that's
That rings true. Yeah. It's also graduate. Yeah. So that rings true.
yeah. Now the ED there. Because I saw what they were doing a video kind of talk with Sanjay and Pato and Branislav. I think another one of them.
And maybe we'll see it.
So for our helper facilitators, we're about halfway through our time, so if you want to switch to a new group, now would be the time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, here, Bushra, let me get out of this out of your way.
Oh, that's not, it's fine.
Okay, I'm going to try to get back for the 6:30 event.
Okay. Take me after me. Yeah, thank you so much, Bob. It was absolutely such a pleasure. Thank you. It was great to meet you too.
I'm waiting for the next conference.
Yeah, well, listen, maybe it's yours. I'd love to come and help you out.
Probably not.
Exactly. Gosh, I mean, you could do a whole conference just on this. It'd be amazing. I'm just saying. You want to be like international leaders in equity and granting. The best way to do that is to be like, yeah, we will bring you back all the time. Thanks, Barbara.
That was great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
It's just such a sprint. I wish it was deeper.
I'm really excited to see what comes out, and
Yeah, me too.
yeah, seems like the process has a momentum. I'll let you get.
Yes, I'm gonna tell them right now. Okay, so we're just gonna shut the video down. Yeah. 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 Okay. All right, everyone, I just want to interrupt your conversations for a brief moment here and have an opportunity. So we're going to be shutting down sort of the lights and sound so that our compatriots from Vancouver Civic Theatres can also have their lunch break. But I want us to have an opportunity right now to give our thanks to our fantastic panelists and to our respondents for bringing their passion and their incredible work to us today in the House. So let's give them a very big round of applause. I also want to mention, noting that there are real differences of opinion and comfort with things like surveys that are collecting data. There is an equity survey that has been put out by Cultural Services, and if you haven't already answered it, and that does feel like a way that you would like to identify yourself, please go ahead and answer that survey so that we can get a better picture of the community here in Vancouver. And from here on, you are welcome to stay here, continue your conversations. We'd love to hear what you think about what you heard here today. We're going to close down the stage, but the house is yours, so hang out, continue talking. Lunch will be from 1 to 2 p.m., so you'll be able to get some food anytime during that period. And thank you all so very much for being with us for advancing reconciliation, equity, and accessibility in granting this morning. Thanks, everybody.